Now, this is a webinar organized by and for the Climate Neutrality Discussion Group of the European Green Party. And the background is that we adopted a resolution on declaring climate emergency late last year, actually here in Tampere, where I'm currently joining you when we had the European Green Party Council meeting. And that resolution also kind of defined the guidelines for setting up a campaign for the European Green Party on climate emergency and climate neutrality. Now, many things have happened since then. The EGP office, including Valentin, who just introduced himself in the chat, have been busy drafting plans for the climate campaign for the European Green Party. And we also did a short survey to member parties, and we got responses from 12 member parties, if I'm up to speed. The parties that responded were Hungary, Belgium, that is Groen, France, the Czech Republic, Spain, that is the ICV, Estonia, Austria, Poland, Finland, Ireland, Cyprus, and Germany. And if you did not hear your member party and country mentioned, then it is still possible for your party to join and respond to the survey. If you need any advice, please ask after this seminar. But it would be very useful to get responses from as many member parties as well. What we found looking at the survey results really was that there is a lot of diversity within the European Green family. We have quite a lot of divergence in terms of how detailed or how ambitious or clearly defined the climate neutrality targets in different Green parties are. And there's also quite a lot of divergence in terms of how developed roadmaps and policies the Green parties in different countries have and advocate for. And that kind of gave us the idea to try to help member parties with some capacity building. And when we discussed the survey results in March, in an online meeting of member parties, there was quite a lot of consensus on the need to have a webinar diving a bit deeper into the issues related to climate neutrality. And that brings us to the discussion we are having now. Basically, the purpose of this webinar would be to help us understand better what climate neutrality means, and perhaps more importantly, what it requires and what it entails in terms of policies and action in different sectors. We also have an opportunity to discuss green responses and the differences and similarities as well among the Green parties in different countries. And then finally, also to provide guidance to drafting the next resolution that is being planned for the next European Green Party Council meeting, which will be held online in June. And I will come back to that in the end, but the idea is to try to define in slightly more detail the principles and positions and policies of the European Green family on climate neutrality, and linking that to the very topical discussion on green recovery and stimulus measures. But we can come back to that a bit later today. Now, just as a reminder for those of you who may have joined us a couple of minutes ago, I suggested that we could all introduce ourselves in the chat, briefly saying our name and our affiliation and where we come from, so that we know who is with us today. Apart from you representing different Green parties and groups, we also have 3 great experts, or to be more precise, 2 experts right now, and Bas Eickhout joining us a bit later from the European Parliament. So we will first hear from our experts, and then we will have, or should have, quite a lot of time for discussion and questions and answers. So please note those and keep them in mind for later when we open the floor for questions and discussion. We start with Joeri Rogelj, who is a lecturer in climate change and the environment at the Grantham Institute at the Imperial College London. He is one of the most prominent and leading experts internationally in this field. If you read any research articles discussing climate neutrality and related issues, I think you would not be surprised to find Joeri's name under those articles. And he's also very good at communicating issues that tend to be sometimes quite complex to policymakers and others who are not scientific experts and researchers. So very excited to hear what Joeri is going to share with us today. Joeri, I would suggest that you just take the screen, take control, as is very popular these days, and you would have about 20 minutes.
Perfect. I hope you can already hear me. My screen should start.
Yes.
There we are. Good. Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation also. I'm very happy to provide a presentation where I was asked to talk about the what, why, and how of climate neutrality. I thought it was maybe useful at the start of this presentation to quickly look at why I'm presenting. So as Oras already highlighted, I'm a lecturer at Imperial College, and I'm also a senior research scholar for the entire International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. That's an international research institute near Vienna in Austria. And I work on long-term transformation pathways, 1.5 degree emission pathways. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of a paper where I worked on understanding what the NDCs under the Paris Agreement mean. And at the bottom, that's just the headline of a paper that we published in 2015. And it was the first paper looking at zero emission targets as long-term temperatures goal for climate change mitigation. I'm going to start also my timer so I make sure that I stay within the 20 minutes. I'm also one of the lead authors of the annual UNEP emissions gap report, which you might have seen. And I was also a coordinating author of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, also there on the pathways chapter. In it, I will be drawing insights from all these different activities and reports and try to kind of present a comprehensive, or at least comprehensive introduction to carbon neutrality and climate neutrality. How will this talk be structured? In the first part, we will be looking at the what and the why of climate neutrality. What do we mean when we talk about climate neutrality? Why do we need it? By when would we need it globally and in Europe? And then also what have we achieved so far? Then also we're looking at the how of climate neutrality. What measures do we need to put in place to achieve it? Are there any trade-offs, and what are the big ticket items? To start, I actually want to make a very clear distinction between carbon neutrality and climate neutrality. And I hope that I will introduce it now, but I hope that by the end of this presentation, this will be very clear to you as well. Let's start with carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality is a concept that emerged in the scientific literature. It basically means that we reach net zero CO2 emissions. That means for every ton of CO2 that we are still emitting into the atmosphere, we're also somewhere else actively removing 1 ton of CO2, so that on average, the atmosphere doesn't see any increase of our human-made emissions. And carbon neutrality is a requirement, a geophysical requirement to stop warming. And I will explain later in a bit more detail where that requirement comes from. Now, climate neutrality is a concept that emerged more from the policy literature. And I will provide an introduction on that also later. It basically means that we reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide. And so in a way, it achieves more than carbon neutrality. And so by the end of this presentation, I hope that you kind of understand these two concepts, and you understand also all the different points that I've made under this. So starting with carbon neutrality, why do we need carbon neutrality to start with? And for that, I just want to give you a small introduction in the physics of climate change. Now, don't be scared. I hope this is very simple. You see on the right-hand side, you can see three panels, which are empty for the moment, but I will be filling as I go along. On the top panel, you see carbon emissions, and there you see a line of carbon emissions going up, and that is 1 unit of carbon emissions that is often used. Petagrams of carbon, gigatons of CO2, tons of CO2, megatons, you call it, you can put it in there. These are just stylized panels or stylized example. If we put emissions in the atmosphere, concentrations go up, and these are expressed in parts per million, and then temperatures go up in degrees or in Kelvin. And this is how we understand climate change. Now, why do we say that we want to understand carbon neutrality? Well, if we put some carbon emissions into the atmosphere and then suddenly we stop emitting CO2, the concentrations, they slowly equilibrate, they slowly go down to a lower equilibrium level. But most interesting, the temperature increase stays, in terms of geophysical uncertainty, stays relatively constant. And this is true for varying levels of cumulative emissions. So if we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we stop global warming of becoming worse. We basically stop temperature going up. And so we can put this in a different panel. Now there are cumulative emissions of CO2 on the horizontal axis and temperature increase on the vertical axis. And what you can see is that there is roughly a linear relationship between these two quantities, meaning that if we want to limit warming at any level, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, global CO2 emissions need to become net zero. And this is also something that the IPCC clearly established. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 2013 report, it said cumulative emissions of CO2 largely determine global mean surface warming by the late 21st century and beyond. Most aspects of climate change will persist for many centuries, even if CO2 emissions are stopped. So that really means that if we stop CO2 emissions, warming will not return, will not be reversed, will just stay flat. That is what we expect it to do. That was carbon neutrality. Now we're talking about climate neutrality. So what does that mean? Instead of net zero CO2 emissions, climate neutrality means net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in comparison to carbon neutrality, climate neutrality is a concept that emerged more in the policy literature. In 2014 and 2015, in some reports of the UN Environmental Programme, but then is also a part of Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, where a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases is being mandated to be achieved in the second half of the century. So climate neutrality intends to achieve net zero greenhouse gases expressed in CO2 equivalents. And how do you make other greenhouse gases equivalent to CO2? Through specific conversion factors. And here on the right-hand side, I just put a table where I copied values from the last IPCC assessment report. These are the so-called global warming potentials over 100 years. And what you can see is, for example, what this table tells you is that 1 ton of CO2 equals 28 tons of methane, or 1 ton of CO2, again, equals 265 tons of nitrous oxide in CO2 equivalents. Now, One key difference is that with carbon neutrality is that negative CO2 are required, or carbon dioxide removal is required in order to balance any residual non-CO2 emissions. What does that mean? If we try to reduce our emissions as much as possible, there's still a couple of sectors for which we don't have really strong mitigation options right now. And this is what we call kind of residual, and particularly for non-CO2, methane, and N2O, which are related to agriculture, there are limited mitigation options available. And here what this graph shows you is kind of the lowest levels of non-CO2 emissions in very deep mitigation pathways. And if we want to reach climate neutrality, these levels of non-CO2 emissions need to be balanced or need to be compensated by carbon dioxide removal. And so that is what I show here. And I just highlight this one bar here, which is for this global warming potential of 100. So to balance these, this is globally, of course, to balance these remaining non-CO2 emissions, one would need roughly 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal annually to reach climate neutrality. Now, for carbon neutrality, I showed you that reaching net zero CO2 emissions will halt warming. It will stop warming at the level at which you have reached net zero CO2. So what does climate neutrality bring to you? Well, climate neutrality achieves more than carbon neutrality. And here on the right-hand side, you have a very complicated figure, but I'm going to simplify it a bit. Climate neutrality basically achieves partial atmospheric restoration by also actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it also results in a gradual undoing of warming. So instead of keeping warming stable, it will slowly make sure that warming is again reversed in the long term. And here what this figure on the right-hand side is if you would be keeping climate neutrality constant, and this is of course just an estimate, for 10, 20, 40 or 100 years, you can see how much temperatures would be again reduced by maintaining that state of climate neutrality or net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Now that we understand these two concepts, the question is, by when do we need to achieve climate neutrality to be in agreement with the Paris Agreement? Here I take a few figures from the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5. These are global CO2 emissions, and global CO2 emissions in pathways that limit warming to 1.5 reach carbon neutrality, and I indicated are roughly around mid-century. Of course, there are also non-CO2 emissions, which are methane and nitrous oxide, for example. And these are just expressed relative to 2010. But what you can see here is that in none of the cases, they actually go to zero. Even in the most ambitious and the most stringent mitigation scenarios that we can develop, we do not find options to really totally eliminate those emissions. And that really means that to achieve climate neutrality, carbon neutrality has to be achieved first. And how much earlier does carbon neutrality needs to be achieved compared to climate neutrality? Well, there is also a table in the report that provides us with some information there. And these are numbers that I drew from table 2.4 of this, one of those recent special reports. And particularly, I'm going to try this, just to move this one, apologies. We're now looking here at, here at this one. Pathways limiting global warming to 1.5. You can see that we have climate neutrality here around 2070 and carbon neutrality around 2050. I obviously have to practice more on drawing on a computer screen. So what you can see is that carbon neutrality is achieved roughly 20 years earlier compared to climate neutrality or net zero greenhouse gas emissions in these scenarios. So if we then look at the Paris Agreement actually also indicates this. In Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, it says that and I highlighted it here, a balance needs to be achieved between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. So the Paris Agreement already mandates that we need to reach net zero greenhouse gases between 2050 and 2100, somewhere there. So this was all globally. The question becomes now, what does Europe need to do, or by when Europe need to achieve climate neutrality to be in line with the Paris Agreement? And for that, these 5 words that are now highlighted are very important, and that is that globally we need to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but on the basis of equity. And what that means, it means that the timing of national net zero targets depends on more than science. Science can tell you everything about what happens on the global scale, but if you want to define what is your appropriate national target, you also need to take into consideration considerations of fairness and equity, how much a country already has contributed to emissions in the past, which capacities it has to reduce that. Some countries, for example, with large potentials for carbon dioxide removal have a much easier job than countries that have absolutely no potential for any carbon dioxide removal at all. And then on the right-hand side, there are also methodological choices that need to be made. And these, for example, relate to which emissions are covered. Do we use consumption-based or production-based? So do we also account for imported emissions that are embedded in imported goods or not? All these choices are, they can definitely be scientific guidelines, but ultimately these are societal choices which typically members of parliament would make as representatives of that society. I'm just moving around this thing here. Yes. What does this mean for annual emission reductions? This is a figure that I found that comes from the European Environmental Agency, with a 2030 target of -40, and then the older -80 to -95 emission reduction goal for Europe. Here, I just updated it, just drawing on this graph here, with a target of at least 50 and towards 55% for the European Green Deal update, with the climate neutrality target by 2050. Important here, however, are the green lines and the yellow lines. The green lines is the projection of what existing measures would bring us in terms of emission reductions, and the yellow line with so-called additional measures. In both cases, it is clear that they were not in line with the previous targets and are definitely not in line with achieving a 50% reductions by 2030, and then the path towards climate neutrality by 2050 becomes increasingly difficult. So what kind of measures do we need to achieve this? Also here we can go back to the IPCC 1.5 report, because I think these insights really are very similar. The IPCC report says limiting warming to 1.5 would require rapid, far-reaching changes on an unprecedented scale. What does it mean? Rapid means really in the next decade, we need to see strong emission reductions. Far-reaching means that we need to take into account, or we need to change the way in which we produce energy, in which we need to, in the way in which we use the land, in which we build houses or design our cities, and in the way we produce our products. And most important is also that climate neutrality really needs stringent climate action everywhere. So there is not really a sector that is off the hook here. despite all sectors having to contribute, not all pathways are created equal. Here on the right-hand side, there are four pathways that the IPCC selected. They all reach carbon neutrality because these are CO2 emissions here, but they also need reach climate neutrality. But they do so in very different ways and with a very different reliance on carbon dioxide removal. And carbon dioxide removal has also can have potential negative side effects, particularly linked to food security, because some of those measures rely on land to produce bioenergy, which can then come in conflict with food productions or also water security. Finally, this is also the case for the European level. This is a figure I drew from a report or an analysis in support of a communication from the Commission. It basically shows how the emissions in Europe, all greenhouse gas emissions now can be brought back to net zero, but importantly, with the different sectors contributing different parts. As you can see, every sector contributes. But on the right-hand side, you can see these two graphs, and these two graphs or these two bars, they show different ways of achieving climate neutrality. The left one relies a lot on carbon dioxide removal technologies, whereas the right bar relies more on lifestyle changes and on the enhancement or the improvement of natural sinks. And as you can see, much less on carbon removal technology, so a much smaller red part there. And this is then my last slide. What has to be done to achieve climate neutrality? Basically, everything. This includes the power sector, which needs to be decarbonized before 2050 with negative emissions thereafter. It involves electrification, higher recycling rates, hydrogen in specific applications in industry, efficiency, heat pumps, low carbon and construction in the building sector, electrifications, alternatives to air travels, mobility as a service in the transport sector, healthy diets and energy and material efficiency, changes in our lifestyle, and particularly also a sustained carbon uptake in our land and forestry sector. So with that, I came at the end of my 20 minutes. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Joeri. I think this has been a very helpful introduction, and I understand we can share the presentation with the participants later on. So if people want to come back to the presentation, that will be possible. I would propose that we now take Ulriikka Aarnio, who is representing Climate Action Network Europe, and will provide a civil society perspective. And after Ulriikka's comments, we could have just a second. We could have questions and comments to both of our experts. So Ulriikka, please, you have the floor.
Good. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. So my name is Ulriikka Aarnio. I'm coming from an organization called Climate Action Network Europe. We're an umbrella organization of 160 European NGOs and NGO networks working on climate. And we're part of the CAN International, the global network with 1,100 members. So thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I have 3 short points that I'd like to make. First, I have to say that thanks, Joeri, for the great presentation. It also had new information for me, or I think I knew the difference between carbon neutrality and climate neutrality, but I have been using them very comfortably in any possible way and mixing them up. So I might do so in my presentation now. But I have to say that we decided already years ago when we started to discuss this net zero, climate neutrality, carbon neutrality. We had lots of concerns over the terms and if they would be taken over by someone, and we decided that we use them and we own them, but I will be more careful from now on when using these. Not sure if I managed to do it today. So firstly, why we NGOs see climate neutrality or net zero targets so very important. We started to work on this concept already many years ago, before Paris, for the simple reason that we, of course, understood that from science that we have no other way. Emissions need to go to net zero, and most likely even to net negative. And secondly, we saw it as a very powerful concept compared, for example, the targets that countries had. For example, the EU target was at the time -80 to -95% from 1990 level by year X. So everyone understands zero much better when it's zero across the board. It applies for everyone, every country, every sector, every individual. So we thought that there's a great benefit in the clarity of the message, and I think that it's true also. And we also saw it a bit as a grand challenge. Of course, going to zero or net zero is challenging, but it's a bit on the kind of a man on the moon type of challenge, that it has to be achieved and it can be done. So at the time when we discussed these net zero targets, we were of course worried that is it politically wrong to focus in the long term. We were concerned that it's easier for politicians to take ambitious long-term commitments and then avoid the more difficult near-term ones. And I think this is also true. But however, we then at the time thought that the gains were greater than the possible threats. And I think that at the moment, now that we have the net zero concept in the Paris Agreement, we have it in many countries, businesses, cities, regions have adopted it. It has proven to be a very powerful tool. And I would say that now we already also start to see it in the way that we intended it, that we have the direction of travel is clear, but then we start to unpack it and see what it means in the near term. So I would say that this net zero, climate neutrality, carbon neutrality, we have kind of won this. It's now so taken over by most everyone, and those who yet haven't are really now under pressure to see that those sectors, businesses, they would need to really find a way to take them, or they would be considered as sectors or businesses that will not have a future. So the direction of travel is clear. So yes, so the end point matters, and we're of course fighting to have these 0 points on the timeline as early as possible. But like also we saw in the previous presentation, what really matters for the atmosphere is the way we get there, the pathway. That the CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere. So the point targets are really just a reference points, but what defines warming are the annual cumulative emissions. And however we look at the rests of the carbon budgets compared to our annual emissions now, the whole carbon budget cake will be eaten unless we take really very drastic measures starting from this year. So if we want to try to stretch it over to 2050 or 2040 even, it needs to be very steep at this end, and then we can spread the cake for many years. So therefore, at the same time that we have been fighting to get the net zero targets adopted, we have been fighting in two ends. And our main fight has been on the revision of the 2030 targets, for example, the EU's 2030 target for us particularly. So, but then this pathway going to zero, as societies, we have few options. Joeri also showed us the 4 pathways 1, 2, 3, and 4. For example, they all are very difficult. There's no easy options anymore left, and they're difficult in different ways. For example, in all of these, we need to reduce emissions very drastically, but in the ones that we won't rely in large scale of carbon dioxide removal, we will need to go down extremely fast. Large-scale carbon dioxide removal is also not easy and comes with side effects. So we are not really yet having this discussion that what kind of societies we want to. Are we ready to do these moves to reduce our travel frequency and ways, as well as our dietary habits, etc. So they all are difficult, and this discussion in conceptual level has not yet really been had. But also then go into more policy discussion, for example, in the EU. Now that we have the net zero target adopted, we need to start to figure out when different sectors need to be at zero, which sectors need to go first, which ones will be allowed to still have some residual emissions, which sectors are allowed to go to zero later on. So this discussion is still one that we need to have. And then thirdly and lastly, the world economy that does not produce emissions, that the kind of economy that we need to have in a couple of decades, that where we are at the climate neutrality, if we want to keep the habitable planet, it looks very different to the one that we have now. And I think that this is a main challenge for us, both for us NGOs and for the Greens. We would need to be able to visualize the future that we want a bit better, because we don't want the future that we have now, where we want to fight against this one, but it is very difficult until we can have the inspiring vision for the future that goes beyond the pictures of the windmills and bicycles that will surely also play a part, but we would need to do a bit more work on that. I think that now that we have the net zero targets, we have the understanding from science what it means, and now we need to really focus on the way, sector by sector, how we get there. And I think this task is something that we both should be very obsessed with in developing one. This is where I want to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulriikka. And now is an excellent opportunity for all of us to ask questions from our 2 experts. I suggested that you can use the chat already, and David, I believe from the Green Party of England and Wales, already did so. He's asking what research there is about the willingness of people in Europe to reduce flying by, say, 60% by 2030. And I could expand on that linking to what Ulriikka was saying, kind of ask a broader question about the willingness of people in general to adopt these extremely low carbon lifestyles that would be required to get to climate neutrality in the time scale we have. I would propose that we take a bunch of questions in the interest of time, and then get back to both Joeri and Ulriikka and give them a possibility to respond. Valentin from the European Green Party office, about the same thing. Yeah, basically addressing also other lifestyle choices that will be necessary to get to climate neutrality. Any other questions you have in mind, please use the raise hand function if you can find it, or just type in the chat window your questions. But while people are thinking, now Ulriikka and Joeri, would you want to give it a try and respond to the question about lifestyle choices and the willingness of people to go very low carbon?
Yeah, I can maybe first respond from the scientific side there, and then maybe Ulriikka can more from what she knows from Cannes maybe. Well, I think there are quite a few studies out there that kind of just look at how quick people's behavior can change, and I think the answer there is both very slow and very quickly at the same time, and that really also shows from a scientific point of view the challenge of these of designing policies that need to reach these very deep emissions reductions. Just to be sure, in order to reduce emissions by 60% by 2030, we don't need 60% less flights because there are other ways to reduce those emissions. However, limiting the amount of flights is definitely a good thing. So understanding how that can be done is a good way forward. On the question of willingness to give up what people consider freedoms, I think the research there shows that instead of giving up, it's about providing alternatives that are better. So people do not want to or prefer to give up these what their current has. I think some of them can be driven by policy. Some of them are driven by necessity. Some of them often have a very initial high threshold, but then after a couple of years or even just 1 year, people get really used to it. So there is quite a bit of literature on that, but it's always very kind of location specific.
Thank you, Joeri. What about Ulriikka?
Yeah, maybe just to say, for example, on the dietary sector and how willing we are to reduce eating meat, I think it has been very helpful to tackle this from the health perspective rather than from the emissions perspective. I think the health angle is an issue that works for everyone, and I think that there we see so delicious alternatives already that are healthier and cheaper and better for the environment. Then this I see a lot of potential happening very quickly. But for the research, I don't think we have any comprehensive. I haven't seen any comprehensive one. Maybe Oras, you would know even better.
Well, yes, thank you. First of all, Ulriikka, I could perhaps flag one study that has looked at that issue to some extent. I incidentally also work professionally on these issues at the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. And Sitra commissioned a study recently looking at 1.5 degree compatible lifestyles. And that report is kind of a deep dive into what our lives would look like on a relatively concrete level if we actually were serious about keeping global heating to 1.5 degrees. So that's one resource I could point at. Marko Kasik from the Estonian Greens is making the point about the alternatives provided by technology, which links nicely to what Ulriikka and Joeri were both saying, not necessarily needing to give up, but rather providing alternative low or zero carbon ways of meeting people's needs, either through technology or other options. Magdalena Davis is asking about the sector by sector kind of division of labor and timetable for emission reductions. I think the short answer here would be that there is no clear plan, or at least not something that everyone agrees on, but clearly some sectors are much more difficult for emission reductions than others. And usually the hard to abate sectors that have been identified would be air transport, marine transport, agriculture, and then some industrial processes. Tony Firkins.
Maybe I can also add to that.
Please, absolutely, go ahead.
So, I mean, Ulriikka and Oras are totally right that there is indeed kind of a staging in terms of emission reductions in different sectors. But on the contrary, the policy effort is not necessarily staged. It is the policy effort needs to be quite high in each of those sectors, because even those sectors that are assumed to only reduce later on, they do so because currently we don't have the technologies or the options to reduce very quickly, very steeply. Those options won't happen if there is not a clear policy signal, and if there is not clear research and R&D in those sectors that drives those or that puts incentives so that those sectors will reduce in the long term. And I'm thinking particularly about the industry sector here, where some processes have are reliant on carbon producing processes. So if no alternatives to those processes are developed at an industrial scale, then even 20 years from now, those sectors won't be reducing their emissions. So in terms of policy attention or policy focus, all sectors kind of need attention, but some of them will deliver sooner than others.
Yeah, to agree with Joeri, yes, completely. But what I would like to point out that is that I think that now probably all sectors think that they can be the ones that can still have those residual, those positive emissions. So we would need to also look at which ones are those that actually need to go to zero to real zero.
Thank you very much. There was a question, just a second, by Tony Firkins about the setting the climate neutrality target date in relation to the probabilities of keeping global heating to 1.5 degrees, and then equity, both intergenerational as well as international. I think that is probably something, Joeri, you could address.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, what you highlight there are indeed the choices that as a society one needs to make. First, what is the probability with which you want to, or what is the likelihood with which you want to achieve your target? So there is an uncertainty. We don't know exactly how much the Earth will warm for a given amount of carbon dioxide. We're sure it will warm, but just not by how much. And if we then want to stay below 1.5, we can choose to do so with a high likelihood, 90% or 66, or just with 50%, 1 in 2. That does change the timing of net zero quite a bit. At the same time, it's much smaller, that uncertainty much smaller than the equity adjustments that you would consider related to fairness between countries. Because you can imagine that the situation of a developed country or the EU is very different from a developing country in Africa, either because they have much lower GDP, but also because EU has much higher infrastructure, has much higher research and development, and so on. So those uncertainties related to equity are much higher and will affect the net zero date to a much larger degree. So only if those choices are first made, as a scientist, I would be able to quantify what it means exactly.
Thank you.
Maybe I can give you one example. The difference between a 50% chance or 1 in 2 chance and a 66% chance of limiting warming to 1.5. The net zero date difference is, off the top of my head, would be around 66, less than 10 years. So the difference is really not that big, and in that sense, even depends stronger on how you go to net zero.
Thank you very much. On that note, I can share a link to another publication which looked at various compatible carbon budgets and pathways for the European Union and Finland specifically. And it addresses this equity question as well. And the message, for instance, for a country like Finland was that basically using almost any imaginable equity criterion for defining a Paris-compatible pathway for emission reductions in Finland would mean that Finland would need to be at net zero emissions in the 2030s already, and by 2050 the emissions would have to be very strongly negative, and also the same applies to a lesser extent to the whole European Union. We do have a couple of minutes left, so this is a great opportunity for people to ask questions. Would that be Richard, is making a good point about the kind of feasibility of rapid emission reductions, taking into account the different kind of delays and inertia factors, because you can't change things overnight, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And this links also back to what Joeri was saying earlier about the need to address all sectors immediately, because otherwise you might need carbon lock-in of high emission pathways for many decades to come if we don't make the necessary changes starting from today. Any last questions or comments? You can raise hand or write in the chat box. Either way works fine. Or yes. Yes, degrowth, economic growth versus emissions reductions. That's a classic. Joeri, do you want to give it a go?
Yes, very shortly. Yeah, I just haven't seen any study that really provides a convincing degrowth future. If you think that emissions are indeed GDP times CO2 intensity, or then GDP per capita times population, there are two ways in which you can reduce emissions according to that equation. One is indeed degrowth, so less GDP per capita, or less population. But I think while populations, shouldn't be exploding, but I think a world with 0 people to get to net zero emissions is not the society I like to live in. And then the same with GDP. Even degrowth won't change the fact that CO2 emissions are being produced, and the fact that we need to get to net zero kind of shows the all-encompassing nature of this challenge. But yeah, bottom line is I haven't seen any study that convincingly produces a degrowth narrative that would work actually.
Thank you. I see Bas yet with us, so let's take the last 2 questions. First, I think Richard again, asking about reducing power emissions across Europe. I could perhaps expand on that and bring a regional dimension, because many of our discussions tend to have a Western or Northern bias. But then if you look at countries like Poland, the challenges can be a bit different. So perhaps Ulriikka, if you could address that, working on Europe and different parts of Europe. And then Daniel is asking, or Daniel, I don't know which one, question. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to go back to the target date, because it seems to me that the 50% is already at very high risk. If that's 50% of disaster, that's an impossibly unacceptable risk. So why are we even talking about longer timescales? I just want to raise the issue of timescale and how critical it is.
Thank you. Now, Ulriikka, Joeri, last reactions, responses.
Yeah, very last words from me. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I have a vet appointment now. So I try to answer a question. Yes. For now, I think we have an amazing opportunity. There's very few countries coming with the COVID crisis, but one thing that we will have is the massive amounts of stimulus money. So this is now our chance to accelerate the transition in all across in every country. That much more than we would have foreseen. So therefore, also I think it's urgent that we will have our plans ready as soon as possible, because we will soon see a lot of money flowing, and if we don't have the right ideas on the table, then they will not be used. So can we reduce power emissions right across Europe? Yeah, yes, more difficult in other countries, but we will have many tools also in a European financial policy box to address that, and the people who work on these sectors that will not have a future, that they might need to go down surprisingly fast, but therefore this comes to the other topic that we're not going to discuss today, how to support these people in the transition. But I have to go now. Thanks a lot for the invitation and the questions and the discussions, and all the best, and see you soon.
Thank you, Ulriikka. I hope your dog gets better.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Joeri, final words.
Yeah, I can maybe speak to the question on the 50%, and I think it was Daniel. Yes, I mean, ultimately, this 50% is a societal value judgment. Unfortunately, we are now in a position, because we haven't done much for the last 20 years, and emissions have gone up since quite significantly since 1990 even, that we cannot reach 100%. But even if we have a 50% for 1.5, it doesn't mean that in 1 out of 2 cases we will see the apocalypse. So if we do everything we need to do today to limit warming to 1.5 with 50% chance, that means that we will have a 85% chance that we actually effectively limit warming to 2 degrees. So we end up somewhere there in the range between 1.5 and 2. At the same time, these probabilities are also depending on our knowledge today. So we won't be starting a path today and not change anything to that path until we reach 1.5 or 2 degrees. So setting a policy with that has a 50% chance of reaching or limiting warming to 1.5 basically means that there is a 1 in 2 chance that you will have to make your policy more stringent over the course of the next decades in order to achieve your goal. But at the same time, in 1 out of 2 cases, you might be able to kind of relax a bit, or if you have some bad luck some bad luck along the way, you might still be able to make it. So unfortunately, it would have been great if we would have started emission reductions 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but we didn't. And I would, of course, say the higher the probability of achieving your goal, the more scientifically robust it is. At the same time, one also needs to see what is technologically and societally possible. And for that, there's then other studies.
Well, thank you so much, Joeri. Thank you for taking the time and sharing all these extremely useful insights with us. You are free, of course, to stay here if you don't have anything more fun and exciting to do. But you can, of course, leave and go back to your important work, which we all appreciate and use for our action on climate. Now, Bas has joined us, which is great because he's the one who is going to talk to us next. Bas, being a member of the European Parliament and one of the most knowledgeable people in the Parliament on climate policy and action, incidentally also the vice chair of the Green Group in the European Parliament. So who would be better to talk to us about European climate policy and climate neutrality from a European perspective? Also, hopefully, perhaps telling a bit about what the Green Group in the European Parliament has been doing and continues to do on climate neutrality that our member parties in different parts of Europe could use. So, Bas, it's your turn.
Good afternoon, Oras. Thanks a lot. I hope everyone can hear me. Alrighty, thanks a lot. Good afternoon. I think I prepared a bit of a slide to go through a couple of topics, which I can now, I think I can share it myself. Let's see whether that works. Okay, you see that now? Yeah, right. At least I can. Good. Because when you ask me that, and I will get, of course, into all the details later on, but I do think we cannot escape the entire discussion around how is Corona and how is the crisis going to affect all the European policies. And we are in the middle of it, so we can't predict it entirely yet on how things will be influenced, but that this will have a major impact on the discussions is of course obvious. And I think the jury is still out whether now the end game will be better thanks to Corona or much more complicated and much more difficult. And I will guide you through a bit on why I say that. But let me first start just with what the Green Deal is, because I think if you look at the proposals of the Commission until now, the European Commission, I think for the first time ever, we have a European Commission who is at least in words putting all climate policies very central. And broader than just climate, they really want to look at a total change of our economy and preparing that for a climate neutral economy, but climate neutrality, and apologies that I couldn't join earlier on, but if you talk about climate neutrality of an economy, this really means it will touch upon every sector, and it is a change in every sector that is huge. So any politician who will tell you, this is going to be an easy one, is lying, basically. This is a transition throughout the entire economic sector, and that will be quite challenging. Of course, you can say now, thanks to Corona, there is an appetite for more broader discussions around our economy anyhow. So we think we should use that momentum, but clearly the huge unemployment that is to be expected from the Corona crisis will also impact some of the political discussion. And as you have seen, the entire idea of going to a climate neutral economy has dropped a bit from the political agenda, at least for now. But I think it will come back quite soon, and I'll show you in which directions. Now, going to this Green Deal that the Commission was promoting, this is how they published it in December, which is fairly recent still, but feels a very long while ago, thanks to all the things that happened in between. But here you also see that the Commission, at least in words, is understanding that the Green Deal is covering all the different issues. So we are talking about a climate law, which is basically, you start at the top left, which is basically setting the targets, which unfortunately, if you are working in Europe, there's always about target setting. It's very important, but of course, it's only the beginning of a discussion. The next step, for example, is you have to go to the energy sector. The targets that we agreed upon until now are insufficient to really get to climate neutrality by 2050. There is, of course, a discussion, is 2050 not too late already? I think that in the end, we as Greens in the Green group signed up to this one, okay, 2050 the latest, but the earlier the better. But this means that the energy sector for sure needs to go to a zero emission setting even faster. Think 2040 the latest, and that is 20 years time from now. So that's a huge challenge for the energy sector, and therefore we will have to look also on the energy policies. Then you have the entire industrial agenda that needs to be looked at, and very much linked to the entire circular economy. So we'll get to that. And then, of course, if you go to, and I think that was also just briefly discussed, if you look at huge emission reductions, then the domestic sector, housing, will have to be looked at in a very explicit way as well. If you turn to the right of the circle of this Green Deal, mobility, all the different sectors where we will look at, what does this mean for our future cars, trucks, aviation, maritime? It will have a huge impact on there. And then, of course, you have farm to fork biodiversity, which is the entire land use system that also will need to change, and probably is going to be one of the more complicated sectors to really go to a climate neutrality. And if you are moving to more circular and an industrial agenda, from a green perspective, it would be good to have a zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment. All that is certainly being mentioned by the Commission, so at least they have their identification of topics right. And on top of that, of course, or at the bottom is the big discussion, how to finance. That was already a huge discussion before the Corona crisis. Well, how to finance after the Corona crisis, that question will only get more complicated. We'll go to that as well. Let's go to the Corona crisis. This was all before that, and you can say that the Commission was doing a fairly good job in at least using the right buzzwords. But of course, we were all eager to wait then, okay, this is the agenda setting that we have seen, but now what are you going to publish, and what are you going to put forward in order to really deliver on these issues? And we were in the middle of all kind of publications from the European Commissions on all these elements when the Corona crisis hit Europe. And immediately you saw some of the usual suspects, of course, using that moment of Corona crisis. You could also say misuse. Business Europe is the umbrella organization of all European businesses. So the European umbrella organization of all the national business associations. And immediately, of course, calling to delay non-essential environment and climate-related consultations and proposals. I always am a bit struggling what you would call a non-essential environment and climate-related legislation, but Business Europe is managing to get those words into one sentence. And you see that at least it is having an impact on how the Commission is now planning its work, because when they are now looking at their new work program, which is really a kind of a process of all the proposals that they want to publish the coming period in time, there it's very clear that a couple of these Green Deal elements will be delayed. And for those who really want to go into, but this shows you a bit that there was an entire set of more detailed proposals that were coming up, and you see that that is having an effect quite a lot. What the Commission, for now, what seems to be maintained, and that is interesting, it's what they are intending with sustainable finance. And sustainable finance is really about talking about making sure that we have a financial sector that knows on how to invest in green issues. And again, as I said, this investment need has only got bigger. And clearly it is a good signal that at least the Commission is realizing that even if we are talking a huge investment plan for the future, then let's make sure that it's still in line with the sustainability agenda. The climate law, I will get to the climate law later on, but that was published before Corona hit Europe. It was the first week of March. So the climate law is presented, but this is mainly enshrining 2050 into law So the climate neutrality, it's still unclear on what that means for 2030, a quite crucial stepping stone towards climate neutrality, of course. And clearly what the Commission is maintaining is what you will hear a lot next week when the Commission will come out with their investment program. They are very likely putting a lot of money onto a renovation wave. And I think that has been mentioned before. And I think this is one of those issues that is not controversial, because we need to renovate, we need to have more efficient housing. It is helping a lot of employment, and it is of course also helping consumers to have a far lower energy bill. So in that sense, it's a no-brainer that this renovation wave should be continued also as part of the Corona investment plan. And you will see that very likely next week as a very important part of the proposals of the Commission, which I think we can only welcome. But then, having looked at these headlines, then you see that all the other elements, looking at renewables, biodiversity, farm to fork, which is agriculture, the chemical strategy for sustainability, strategy for sustainable and smart mobility. So all the other sectors, you see that they are at least thinking of delays. And the big question is to what extent, how much will that be delayed? So delays will be there. Question is how much, and not too many. But of course, it's not only about being delayed, but also about will they keep the level of ambition that was promised when they discussed it. And there you also see the first signs of discussion that is now popping up at the European level. If you look at one of the key sectors that we need to discuss when you are talking about climate neutrality, it's of course aviation. And I think you all recognize it in all the countries, but this is going to be one of the crucial discussions and one of the first discussions that you will see. It's how to save our airlines, right? You've seen the first initiatives in Austria, in France, in the Netherlands. We know that Germany is next, and we also know from Scandinavian airlines, basically every airline needs money, needs public money, and there will be a challenge to what extent policymakers will be daring to put conditions to the different airliners. The Commission, as one of the first reactions on the Green Deal, has been lowering their state aid guidelines to say, okay, state aid is now possible. But of course, they also do know, and this will very likely also come very soon, is that they realize we need to do more on state aid again. We need to put in some rules. And this is the Transport Commissioner, the picture you see, Adina Valian. She's from Romania, and she is clearly on the line. We just have to give them money. We just have to save the airliners, and we should not talk about any green conditioning. Well, this is going to be a big battle, because if every country on its own needs to decide on green conditioning, you will get an uneven playing field, not very welcome probably. So we will need clear Commission guidelines and to make sure that the money will go to airlines. It will be conditioned green, for example, that they have to come up with a CO2 reduction path. That's one of the big discussions that is being fought now around all the airliners. One of the other big battles is, of course, what is going to happen with our biodiversity and farm to fork strategy. That was always an epic battle, as this headline is saying. This is always the big fight between the environmental side of the Commission and the agriculture side of the Commission. I can tell you that fight has only intensified to a lot. Thanks to the Corona crisis, because now what you see, and you see that already being copied by the Christian Democrats in the European Parliament, now in these times of despair and crisis, we should not give too many administrative hurdles for our farmers. They need to produce food, and don't bother them with any green policy. This from farm to fork strategy is planned to be a very important instrument to really refine our CAP reform, the reform of the common agriculture policies, which is of course one of the key battlegrounds when you are talking about green policies at the agriculture system. Whether the ambition level from farm to fork can be maintained, that remains to be seen. Now we're still fighting over when will the from farm to fork strategy be published. We hope end of May, which is already 2 months later than the initial planning. And as said, one of the big discussions that you will see, and that is now most immediate, is about the financing. How can we make sure that there is enough money? And this is going to be a big battle between, well, first of all, the North and the South. The North being very reluctant to prepare for a huge European response on financing. So that's countries like Finland, sorry, Oras, but also the Netherlands, sorry, myself, who are not so much into giving the EU a lot of room for an investment program. But on top of that, since it will be linked to the EU budget, there will also be a big clash between East and West about how much of that budget should then go to green financing. And that is, of course, where the West might be more in favor of, but not so much the East. So this kind of North, South and East-West discussion, you will see the big start of it next week when the Commission is going to propose their investment program linked to the EU budget. I would say sit tight and watch a long discussion to be expected. Then we move to the climate law, because this is all the fun around it. The climate law has been presented before, so it is at least in the hands of the policymakers. And this is now also where all the member states need to position themselves on. And this is, of course, going to be one of the key battlegrounds on the first law coming from the Green Deal, and also probably the first Green Deal law that will be enshrined after the corona crisis. So there's on the one hand this discussion on 2050 climate neutrality, but the big discussion will be on what is going to happen with the 2030 target. For that, the Commission promised a comprehensive impact assessment to be published in September. Well, will they maintain the date of September? Also there, it might get complicated, because in order to do an impact assessment on 2030, you need, of course, also a good projection on the economic development until 2030. Guess what? That might be a bit more complicated with the current corona crisis hitting all the economic prospects. So also there, the commissioner responsible for the Green Deal, Timmermans, was alluding to it might get delayed from September. And that is, of course, well, first of all, it is a bad signal, because this entire climate law will set the targets. And on top of that, that will then start a huge discussion on all the policies that we are having at the European level. So that's the Renewable Directive. It's the Efficiency Directive linked to this renovation wave. This is linked to the CO2 standards for cars, for trucks. For example, for cars, if we look serious at climate neutrality, this means that passenger cars need to be zero emission by 2030. So that means we need to get out of the combustion engine by 2030. That is a big challenge, with some of the industry now asking for, again, more time for adopting their 2020 targets, for example, which is not even close to, of course, phasing out the combustion engine. So all this setting of the 2030 target the next step will be a look at all the policies around it. So that's a huge point. But on the international dimension, it also is crucial. And again, sorry for being late. I don't know to what extent that has been said, but if Europe is not going to be ready for the climate summit, well, it's not going to be this year. Glasgow has also been postponed. It will be next year, but that will be the moment to have an increase of all the national determined contributions of countries around the globe. Because Europe might be moving maybe closer to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, but if the rest of the world doesn't follow, it's still out of reach. So someone needs to take this first step in really taking bold, more action in climate target increase. And everyone is, of course, looking at Europe, because, and this is the plan, this is the mechanism that we have in the Paris Agreement, by 2020 is the moment that you increase your targets, otherwise you lose 5 years down the road. Well, Glasgow should be that moment. That is now being postponed to 2021. I think no one will complain about that maybe for this time we have this moment in time for an increased ambition in 2021. That gives Europe a bit more time. Fortunately, we were already quite late. But more delay in the climate law, and then again being late as Europe for that moment in Glasgow to increase our targets, will have a very negative impact on all the discussions in the other regions in the world who are also impacted by the coronavirus. For example, not to mention China. So, and this is, I'm going to the last slides, and this is, well, this is a bit already said in the previous one, but if you want to really go to a 1.5 degree compatible scenario, you are talking about these kind of annual reduction percentages. And that means huge renovations. That means very ambitious targets on phasing out the combustion engine for transport. That means a total change in our aviation sector, which needs to be tied to the rescue programs. It requires an increase of investment in renewables that is slowing down already before the corona crisis. And that needs, of course, an increased target setting in order that the emission trading system of the EU, which is setting the carbon price, will also be much more fundamental, because the last review of the emission trading system helped to get the price a bit to the levels of 20 to 25 euros per ton CO2, but that price has collapsed now as well, of course, due to the corona crisis. And we all know, if you want to be compatible with this kind of pathways, the carbon price needs to be above 50 and probably go into the hundreds if you look at it down the road. If you now look at the current carbon price, also this review of the emission trading system is absolutely necessary, and much more delay we cannot afford, but that will be clashing with this entire corona after crisis investment program, which from a green perspective, we will link as much as possible. But that is a new political debate that is on the table, and on the table was already a quite complicated debate on the climate law that has become more complicated due to the corona crisis. I think that was what I wanted to give as an overview on all the things that are being discussed at the moment in Brussels, or in Brussels, remotely in Brussels.
Thank you very much, Bas. Let me just check how much time you have before you have to run again.
No, I can stay until 6:15.
Oh, excellent. So then we have plenty of time for questions, and also perhaps moving quite organically to discussion. But first, I would like to give the opportunity to ask questions from Bas, in particular about European level policy and the European Parliament and the Green Group there. There is already one question in the chat box about standing up to China and standing up to the USA and China for things like carbon tax, border carbon adjustments, and related issues. Let's also take David, and I see that we seem to have a relatively strong participation from the British Isles. I would just encourage also everyone else to get active, because we want this to be as inclusive as possible. But David, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Bas. You were talking about the European target as being carbon neutrality for 2050. What Joeri, I think, said very clearly was that equity simply means that isn't good enough. We need to be looking at something significantly earlier. I mean, we're not in the EU anymore, so I speak as an outsider, but within the EU, what do you think can be done to bring that forward?
Yeah, that's a good question, David, and not an easy one, because if you now look at the discussion we are having at the European level, it took already quite some effort to get the entire EU to its 2050 climate neutrality. So I think what is now the best strategy is really to go into sectoral policies. I also think, to be very honest, we lost quite some time around this discussion on climate neutrality, whereas of course that is, as you said, it's a long-term discussion. Politicians love to discuss 2050. Be it 2040, is that then really the big fight you need to have? What we need is a immediate change of our current policies. And I think what is good now is that through the climate neutrality, which I agree the date is too late, but through the debate on climate neutrality, we are now getting into a 2030 discussion where at least a majority in Europe seems to realize that, yes, our targets are insufficient, which is already a gain compared to a year ago. So you will have a debate on the increase of your 2030 target. And as said, that will start a debate on your concrete policies. What does that mean for renewable targets, for efficiency? And I think there are the better potentials, because if we keep on fighting on this climate neutrality, that will take us so long that probably we would have needed to be at climate neutrality before the debate is closed. Whereas if we look at renewables, if the price is going down much faster, so all the targets that we agreed upon a couple of years ago are now already outdated. On the CO2 and cars, the phase out of the combustion engine, you know, we now even have Volkswagen who is saying that they are intending to only produce electric cars by 2040. So there is this huge mismatch between some of the technological development on the one hand, and then the targets we are still discussing. So I'm much more eager now to go into the discussions on these sectoral policies, because I think with that we can bring climate neutrality much earlier than if we keep on debating this long-term target. So I would focus very much on the sectoral policies, and hopefully that will bring us faster down.
Can you also address the issue about the US and China and border carbon adjustments?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think before the Corona crisis, for the first time in Europe, there was finally a discussion about a carbon adjustment mechanism. This has been quite difficult at the European level because you have a very dominant trading attitude in Europe, certainly with the UK in the EU, by the way. And for example, the Netherlands and the UK are these kind of free traders countries who hate something like a carbon adjustment mechanism. So I think here, realizing that we need to protect our own industry better, there was a appetite for discussing more the carbon adjustment mechanism. But of course, there was the other side of the story saying, oh, but can we do that in a moment of time where the world is already having quite some trade wars and trade issues? And that's referring, of course, to US and China. Nevertheless, we had the feeling that was more possible. But now with the Corona crisis, and people looking at, oh, we need to get out of this crisis as fast as possible, there will be a push again of the business as usual free traders to say, and let's boost our trade and let's not put any barrier there. So I think this discussion on the carbon adjustment mechanism has become more complicated on that side, politically speaking, but still from an industrial side, there is still quite some support for it from some of the industries, realizing, guys, we are now severely hit by a crisis again, hardly recovered from the previous one. If you now want us to go to a climate neutral policy scene, then we probably need some protection at the EU borders. So I think this clash around the carbon adjustment mechanism is going to be much bigger than before. And I don't know how it will end, but that it will be a huge debate is for sure.
Thank you, Bas. Magdalena Davis has a question about European funding for phasing out coal in Central and Eastern Europe. I think that's a very important question, and I'm sure you can address that as well.
Yep. No, absolutely. And this is, of course, the entire discussion around just transition. And this is where what I meant with the difficulty we get by linking this entire kind of recovery fund that we are going to expect from the EU, where basically all kind of other economic instruments were taboo or were not regarded possible. Now the Commission is trying to put as a central vehicle the MFF, the European budget. But in that European budget, there was already before the Corona crisis this discussion that we really have to look at helping Central and Eastern European countries in the phase out of coal. And that was this transition fund. so you will see that the East will make sure that they want to see those funds being maintained in a proposal, but at the same time, this entire EU budget now also will have to be used for a serious recovery of the South, mainly, because that's where we're talking about when we talk about recovery, because the northern countries probably can do it much better from their national budgets. So that is complicating the entire debate around the MFF, the EU budget. But that's why the Greens are asking for a serious increase in the EU budget, because that's the only way to get things done in a multiple discussion that you will see. And for sure, the East is now worried that their promises they got from the previous time now will be watered down when the entire EU budget is also going to be used for the Corona Recovery Fund. Well, that debate is going to be one of the key discussions that you're going to see. And the only thing to solve that is a bigger EU budget. And again, now I look at the countries who were against Eurobonds or whatsoever. At one of these issues, they need to give in. So looking at you, Oras, Finland, looking at myself, Netherlands, they can't keep on blocking all these options. And probably on the EU budget is now the highest pressure going to be to really create more space there.
Just to be clear, I think the Netherlands is much worse than Finland in this regard. But
it's a low bar, or it's a low bar. It is a very
low bar. It is a very low bar indeed. Let's take the final questions. I see Jean asking about the role of loss and damage in European policy when it comes to international climate negotiations and I suppose funding. I would also ask a very practical question, which is related to the resources the Green Group in the European Parliament has in terms of studies or publications that could be of benefit to our member parties. And I see also Jan is here from the Parliament, so perhaps you could say something about that. And then we have, hold on, the chat is jumping. We have Thurger from Denmark. Regulating agricultural emissions at the European level, is that possible? Yeah.
Yeah, I can say something. Yeah.
Yes,
it's
go ahead.
A typical Danish optimism to think that that transport and domestic sector will be very soon going to zero emissions. I think we will still have some time for also looking at the non-ETS still, but I get to that next. That's the agriculture debate. But what do we do about these losses and damages? And then, of course, you get very soon into the discussion on will there be a legal possibility that someone can be held accountable for that? Well, there were not so many topics the last couple of years on the international scene where the EU and the United States were joining forces. This was one of them. At least making sure that okay, loss and damage was accepted, but that it never could become a legal option with teeth, basically. So that's of course trying to prevent any legal case against the EU or the United States. The United States also was still at the table because officially they are still not out of Paris. It was announced and all that, and it is now finally asked for officially, but they were still at the table to make sure that loss and damage would never get to problematic levels, because even for a democratic president, this would be a no-go. So a democratic president will be better than Trump. Also there, a low bar, I would say. But loss and damage is for any president quite complicated. So how people try to solve that is, of course, through finances. So I don't expect much progress on the legality of loss and damage. It probably will be getting part of this entire investment program that is needed. And in the Paris Agreement, it was promised to be on an annual level of $100 billion per year. Well, let's see how that mobilization of that money will be happening now after the Corona crisis. So, and there Europe is really always pretty slow. There was a lot of tough talk of the EU when the United States was not subsidizing the IPCC anymore, and there Europe said, we step in there, but that was the peanuts money compared to the discussion on financing for example, adaptation and these kind of issues. There Europe was already getting difficulties before the corona crisis that will not be easier. Then on agriculture, to conclude on, I think what is the most logical option we have is CAP reform, is this reform of common agriculture policies. You're absolutely right. If we would be relying entirely on non-ETS, that will only get more complicated. For those who don't know, you have the emission trading system, so that's 45% of the EU emissions that's being regulated at the EU level, and that's being, well, that's a ceiling that goes down, so all the industry is allowed to less and less, and they're not falling under that emission trading system, is being solved by national target setting. So each country is getting a national target, and then it's up to the countries to see how they deal with that. But until now, all the countries always looked at the housing and some a bit more on transport, but agriculture was in most of the countries always the more complicated one. Think a country like Ireland, for example, always having difficulties in reaching their targets on the non-ETS side because they have difficulty with transport and agriculture. So if the other sectors would go more to a zero emission, then indeed setting targets on reductions of the agriculture sector might get complicated. This is why what we are now looking for and what we're fighting for is in the current the common agriculture policy reform, is to really link any of the EU money that should be given, that countries should put forward a very serious emission reduction program, and that could be rewarded. This is also a huge battleground that we hope we will get some more leeway on, but probably through that money discussion, you have much more options in steering the agriculture sector than if we have to do it all the way through a target setting specifically for the agriculture sector. Because, and that's really the final point, sectoral policies are always complicated, but you see in the EU more and more as possible. But the sector that it still is most powerful and most difficult, it's the agriculture sector. That hasn't changed since the 60s, I would say. I leave it to that.
On that somber note, thank you very much, Bas, for providing us with these updates. We need to wrap up now, so I'll just quickly run you through what is going to happen next in terms of the resolution for the European Green Party. So we have decided earlier that there will be a resolution that will be discussed at the next European Green Party Council meeting that will take place online in June. The EGP committee had a meeting, and because of the corona situation, there was a decision to kind of readjust the focus of this new resolution so that it links to the need for green recovery and stimulus, something that Bas was also referring to earlier. So there will still be a focus on climate neutrality and what it means in more detail for Europe and different sectors and different timeframes, but there would be a linkage to the topical and very important discussion. Now, regarding the process, what is going to happen is that after this webinar, we will draft the first piece text for the resolution on the 2nd of May. Then on the 4th of May, which is a Monday, we will share this draft with all of you, that is the member parties. And this is usually done through the international secretaries and contacts in your parties. So if you are concerned that you will not get the draft in your hands, please consult your colleagues in your party. There will be another webinar on Monday, the 11th of May, which will provide us with an opportunity to discuss the draft among ourselves. So there you will get a chance to raise your concerns, make some suggestions on changes, ask questions, whatever you want to do. So we will send invitations out relatively soon, but please already note that there is another webinar coming on the 11th of May. Then, based on those discussions with all of you, we will provide the final resolution that will be submitted to the approval of all our member parties on Friday, the 15th of May. And after that, it will go through the usual resolution process and finally adopted, hopefully, on the 13th of June at the online council meeting of the European Green Party. Now, we will come back to discussing the draft resolution on 11th of May in the webinar, but I would just like to flag the possibility of sharing your insights, inputs, wishes, desires already in advance. So if you have strong feelings about what should be included in the resolution, you can always share those in advance with us by email. You can use my address, that's first name dot last name at europeangreens.eu, or find someone at the office of the European Green Party to share those so that we can take those into account already when drafting the first version of the resolution. We want this to be inclusive, obviously, so please do participate and involve also your colleagues. That brings us to the end of this webinar. I just wonder, because Bas did not talk too much about that, if Jan, you wanted to say something about the resources that the Green Group in the European Parliament has available on climate neutrality related topics.
So just to be clear, you mean on existing resources or plans for future? I mean, both to Misha, because he was as a shadow, so member responsible for the negotiating the climate law on behalf of the group. He has been actually leading the work, the internal work on the climate law, both before the publication of the climate law and since the publication of the climate law. So I don't know, Misha, if you want to introduce what you've done already on this. I don't know if Misha is there, right?
Hello, everyone.
Yes, he is.
I can speak a little bit about the climate law. I'm not sure what actually I can follow everything, so I'm not sure if Bas already said everything. But the question of Oras was more like what are the resources that we have, and I think we there's a lot of stuff. I mean, in terms of content, what we have already been publishing, and what we are going to publish. I think the Green Recovery Plan, which is maybe goes in the direction, Oras, that you were talking about. We have our own demands for how a climate law should look like. Actually, a campaign of the Greens in the Parliament, and one from the EGP, which goes into the direction of we need to act now, and we need to have this minus 65% carbon budget, scientific body, etc. I think what is very interesting in terms of sectoral policies is still the study that was commissioned some time ago about the vision scenarios for the European Union, where I think in a long study we show for every sector how to get to minus 55% for the year 2030. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things which are already there, and I think for what is there to come, first of all, watch out for the recovery plan, because it's also very comprehensive, and then I guess we will have to also see how the situation now develops, because we all don't really know what will be the outcome of the corona crisis. I think, I'm not sure whether you've talked about it, but I think the climate law is really the central piece of European climate legislation now, setting the target on which all of the sectoral reforms will orientate on, and also kind of making it or like if we get an ambitious climate law, that will also be in the wake of the next COP negotiations, which is the most important climate negotiations internationally since 5 years. So yeah, we will be definitely working on this, and it will be very also the climate neutrality resolution of the EGP. I think is very important to get all of the member parties also involved, because we can get something done with this climate law, but we also need all of the member states to be on this direction. So we need the member parties in the member states to also push in the right direction.
Indeed. Thank you, Michael. what we will do after this webinar is provide a list of different resources, some of which Mihail mentioned there before, and share that with all of the member parties so that you can use those in your work in your own countries. And then, of course, we will rely quite a bit on the expertise and resources of the Green Group in the European Parliament when working on the resolution for the European Greens. We are now 6 minutes over time. Sorry about that, but I thought it was a very important discussion. Thank you so much for joining this discussion today. As I said, we will continue not too far in the future. There will be another webinar. We will share the invitation soon enough, and then we can continue the discussions. But for now, thank you. Stay safe, and do get back to me by email if you want to raise some issues or share your views.